Quarter end was never a date on the calendar. It was a corporate storm that swallowed reason. The building vibrated with urgency as teams scrambled to meet regulatory deadlines. Phones rang without pause, and printers spat out spreadsheets like panicked confessions. Every department operated under the belief that one mistake could trigger an audit capable of drowning the company in penalties. I sat at my workstation, focused on the tax software I had built from the ground up across 6 exhausting years. It wasn't merely code. It was a living organism that required constant supervision. If any part failed, the consequences wouldn't be theoretical. They would be financial, legal, and catastrophic. My screen glowed with lines of logic I had memorized like scripture. I was working on the final patch that would synchronize new tax brackets with corporate filings, a change the government introduced at the worst possible moment. While other employees complained about spreadsheets and late hours, my concern was deeper. This system processed millions in declarations. One flaw meant lawsuits, penalties, and headlines nobody wanted to read. Yet the responsibility never frightened me. It energized me. Complexity was my territory, and the system performed flawlessly because I treated it like an organism that could not be ignored. As I tested a new encryption layer, my manager, Lucas Porter, approached. Lucas existed in the company like a billboard, visible, loud, and yet hollow. He didn't understand the software, couldn't debug a basic function, and once described my department as the back office that deals with scary numbers. But executives adored him because he knew how to talk. He had mastered the art of saying nothing with confidence and calling it leadership. He walked toward my desk and paused, staring at me as though expecting something dramatic. I anticipated a question about deadlines, server load, or compliance updates. Instead, Lucas tilted his head and delivered a sentence so detached from reality it felt surreal. "Why don't you smile more? It makes people uncomfortable." I thought I misheard him. The room was filled with tension, yet he fixated on something irrelevant to productivity. My job wasn't to entertain. It was to prevent the entire financial structure from imploding. My expression reflected concentration, not hostility. Lucas leaned closer, waiting for an apology I didn't owe. His priorities were clear. Appearance mattered more than performance. He didn't linger long. After dropping his absurd remark, he sauntered away, satisfied with his psychological inspection. I tried to refocus, but the comment gnawed at me. I suspected it wasn't innocent. Lucas liked his staff cheerful, not competent. He once told a senior engineer to relax the vibe while discussing system security. That mindset was dangerous, and now it had found a new target: me. My suspicion proved correct. 30 minutes later, my inbox flashed with an email from HR demanding my presence. Their department sat on the opposite side of the building, decorated with posters about kindness, trust, and positivity, values they preached but rarely demonstrated. I walked in expecting a mundane inquiry. Instead, Lucas sat beside the HR manager, wearing the smug expression of someone preparing to enjoy an execution. The HR manager spoke with a tone polished by workshops and training sessions. She claimed my lack of smiling created discomfort and damaged workplace morale. She read statements describing me as unapproachable, serious, and emotionally distant. None referenced my performance, certifications, incident-free record, or the mission-critical nature of the software I maintained. The conversation wasn't about my contribution. It was about my face. I tried reasoning with them. Quarter end required intense concentration. The slightest mistake could sink the company. A smile wouldn't improve accuracy. It wouldn't validate tax regulations. It wouldn't prevent the system from collapsing under pressure. My logic met a wall. They didn't want explanations. They wanted compliance with an emotional aesthetic. The HR manager slid a paper across the table, a termination letter. Effective immediately. No warning, no improvement plan, no performance review. Lucas smirked, satisfied with the punishment he had fabricated. The architect of their tax infrastructure was dismissed for failing to produce a facial expression. As security escorted me out, I glanced back at the glowing monitors. They hadn't fired an employee. They had removed the only barrier between order and disaster, convinced a smile mattered more than stability. To most people at Fintran Dynamics, the tax software was a mysterious miracle. They believed it operated like an invisible assistant, simple, obedient, and self-sustaining. Employees pressed a button and watched financial statements appear, deductions calculated, and compliance reports printed with flawless precision. They assumed the software performed these tasks because technology was magical. They never wondered who made that magic possible or what it required to keep it alive. They didn't see the endless nights I spent repairing modules broken by last-minute rule changes. They didn't see the regulatory storms that threatened to tear the system apart. They praised automation without understanding the architect. The truth was far less romantic. The system was not an object, they treated it that way, but it was a breathing structure, a complicated organism designed to adapt to the volatile universe of corporate taxation. Thousands of lines of code, layered algorithms, encrypted safeguards, and conditional triggers formed its nervous system. Every quarter, new laws altered tax brackets, audit thresholds, or reporting templates. Each transformation forced me to dissect the system and restructure functions before they broke. A single mistake could corrupt files, miscalculate liabilities, or expose client information to threats that regulators would devour like wolves. The board never cared about these details. For them, tax numbers were like beverages from a vending machine. Insert inputs, press a button, receive results. They didn't comprehend that the machine could explode if someone fed it incorrectly. I became the invisible firefighter who prevented flames they never saw. The system ran smoothly not because it was perfect, but because I never allowed imperfection to reach daylight. Every successful audit was a testament to vigilance, discipline, and technical knowledge that no smile could replicate. Despite all this, the software carried a reputation I disliked: automatic. That single word erased my existence. Nothing in taxation was automatic. Not even the government understood its own rules half the time. When regulations changed, headaches multiplied, and my brain became the interpreter between legislative chaos and corporate survival. The software executed commands only because I anticipated disasters before they materialized. My expertise was the lock, key, and manual. Yet, when the company terminated me for not smiling, they replaced me with someone who barely understood recursion. His name was Nathan, a cheerful intern fresh out of university. He arrived with motivational stickers on his laptop and a confidence that bordered on delusion. He believed enthusiasm could conquer complexity. His resume listed group projects, not systems that handled millions in assets. He grinned when executives praised his energy, oblivious to the avalanche awaiting him. Nathan's first assignment was to generate tax summaries for mid-tier clients. He clicked buttons with a child's excitement, unaware that behind each click rested conditional triggers I had manually calibrated. He didn't know why the system produced a result. He just liked that it did. Management mistook curiosity for competence and celebrated him as the symbol of modernization. They claimed my seriousness had blocked innovation and declared Nathan the embodiment of their future. The board applauded the transition. They claimed new perspectives would elevate productivity and boost morale. They believed the system required enthusiasm more than expertise. They spoke in phrases like fresh energy, youthful synergy, and dynamic leadership evolution. Their ignorance was astounding. They congratulated themselves for replacing the mechanic with someone who didn't know where the engine was located. What none of them realized was that the system didn't run smoothly because it was easy. It ran because I anticipated its needs. Every database update, encryption certificate, rule adjustment, and audit module was manually tested, sometimes days before deadlines, sometimes moments before catastrophic failure. Without understanding its architecture, anyone attempting adjustments was tampering with explosives. They hadn't hired a replacement. They had installed a fuse. What amused me most was that nobody recognized the danger until it was too late. They believed they had removed a problem, unaware they had amputated a vital organ. The tax software wasn't dependent on positivity. It was dependent on precision. Disconnecting me wasn't a staffing decision. It was corporate anesthesia administered seconds before surgery. Their mistake wasn't firing me. Their mistake was assuming the system would forgive them. Quarter end didn't arrive like a date. It arrived like a detonation. At first, employees moved with the confidence of people convinced everything was under control. Managers strutted through hallways repeating empty slogans about teamwork and innovation. The board reassured investors that the company was prepared for its largest tax filing cycle in years. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that the person who maintained the software was no longer inside the building. They believed systems continued functioning simply because someone wished them to. That illusion lasted less than 2 hours. The first signs of trouble appeared when financial analysts tried entering data into the system. Screens froze mid-entry, lines of text flickered, and the software reacted as though exhausted. Restarting didn't help. Each attempt worsened the slowdown. The intern, Nathan, typed commands with the enthusiasm of a student experimenting with tools he barely understood. He reassured everyone that minor bugs were common and that online forums could solve anything. His confidence lulled department heads into brief optimism, but as the workload increased, the system responded with hostility. By midday, the first automated tax calculations locked entire departments out. Employees stared helplessly at login pages that rejected credentials without explanation. Suddenly, decades of corporate bravado disappeared. Panic replaced it. Auditors requested preliminary reports, and accounting supervisors couldn't generate them. The problem was no longer internal, it was regulatory. Every missing document added financial pressure. If the filings weren't completed before the deadline, penalties would strike with surgical precision. Senior executives finally realized that enthusiasm was not a skill set. The board ordered Nathan to fix the issue immediately. He opened the command console and began typing letters without understanding the architecture behind them. He whispered that he had seen similar problems solved by tutorials. He believed documentation could replace experience. He didn't understand that the system was not malfunctioning, it was resisting. The more he tampered, the more errors multiplied. Error logs stretched like endless ribbons, each one referencing modules he had never seen. His fingers shook, but his pride prevented him from admitting defeat. Meanwhile, clients called nonstop, demanding progress updates. Some threatened to terminate contracts. Others warned they would escalate matters to regulatory authorities. Corporate partners expected completed tax declarations within hours, not excuses about software misunderstandings. Executives scrambled between conference rooms, their earlier confidence replaced with sweat-soaked panic. They blamed servers, blamed auditors, blamed workload, blamed fate. They blamed everything except the decision that caused the crisis, firing the one person who could prevent it. Just when chaos seemed contained, the software revealed a deeper complication. To complete the final tax computation, it requested a master authentication code. The system wasn't asking politely, it refused to advance without it. That code unlocked encrypted databases, validated digital signatures, and synchronized government identifiers. Without it, the process halted entirely. A countdown timer flashed on screens, signaling the time remaining before automatic submission would be flagged as incomplete. Once that timer expired, penalties would activate like detonators. Executives assumed the code was written somewhere. They ordered Nathan to locate it. He searched through old manuals, outdated emails, and folders nobody had opened in years. He found nothing. His optimism evaporated. Fear replaced his grin. His voice cracked as he admitted he didn't know where the code was, how it worked, or why it existed. Someone muttered my name. Silence followed. At that moment, everyone finally understood the truth they had ignored. The system didn't trust anyone except the person who built it. They had disconnected their oxygen tank and now wondered why they couldn't breathe. Chaos did not arrive gradually. It erupted like a power surge that fried every illusion of control the executives cherished. The building, once a monument to corporate confidence, now resembled an unplanned emergency drill. Executives sprinted from office to office, shouting fragmented instructions no one understood, while assistants stumbled behind them carrying binders full of financial statements that were suddenly worthless. Every passing second tightened the knot around their ambitions. The same corridors where laughter once echoed now carried the sound of panic, telephones vibrating on desks like alarms no one knew how to silence. The directors, who previously filled meetings with jargon about innovation and synergy, reverted to survival mode. Their polished speeches dissolved into frantic questions and accusations. They scheduled emergency calls with external auditors, legal advisors, and banks who were expecting compliance confirmations. Instead, they received incoherent explanations about unexpected technical difficulties. Voices trembled. The directors no longer looked like leaders. They looked like gamblers discovering their winning streak was based on stolen chips. HR, the department that orchestrated my dismissal, locked themselves behind closed doors. Gone were the motivational posters about optimism and collaboration. Their offices transformed into bunkers of guilt. They whispered among themselves, terrified that the catastrophe unfolding outside their door would eventually demand accountability. Their silence was louder than screams. The same people who once lectured employees about emotional intelligence now avoided eye contact, afraid that every knock on the door meant consequences. My absence was no longer an anecdote. It was a missing limb. Managers who had rolled their eyes at my seriousness now wished I were still glued to my workstation, coaxing the code into cooperation. They no longer cared about smiles or morale. They cared about survival. Without the master authentication code, the system remained paralyzed. Every department that relied on tax summaries, automated statements, and client reports was stranded. The digital heartbeat of the company depended on a single key tied to a person they had discarded for not meeting a subjective standard of friendliness. Desperation grew. They called every retired employee who had ever touched the system, hoping someone had retained fragments of my architecture. The retirees, once considered obsolete, arrived with a mixture of nostalgia and confusion. They were greeted not with handshakes, but with pleas. Executives demanded instant solutions. The retirees stared at terminals filled with code they didn't recognize. They might as well have been reading ancient hieroglyphs. The tax software had evolved under my care, not theirs. They understood the skeleton of the old system, but the structure now contained layers of logic, encryption, and compliance modules built long after their departure. They shook their heads, helpless. Every attempt to bypass the software only made things worse. Directors believed the solution was hidden in a forgotten binder or archived email. They couldn't fathom that knowledge could exist solely in one person's mind. They had built a culture around replaceability, convincing themselves that systems functioned effortlessly regardless of who designed them. That illusion shattered as they discovered expertise was not a file, it was a person. And that person was gone. The intern, Nathan, who once radiated cheerful confidence, crumbled under the pressure. The same smile HR had praised dissolved into tears. He hid in the restroom, repeatedly splashing water on his face, hoping clarity would reveal itself. He replayed video tutorials on his phone, desperately trying to decode problems he did not understand. His confidence turned into humiliation. He realized enthusiasm could not debug encrypted architecture or anticipate regulatory fail points. His locker, decorated with motivational stickers, looked like a mockery of his innocence. The weight of an entire corporation pressed against his chest. Meanwhile, the CFO paced aggressively in his office, veins visible along his neck. For years, he had waved financial projections like trophies. Now those projections meant nothing. Without accurate tax submissions, penalties could strike, investor trust could evaporate, and banks could freeze funding. He slammed his fist against the wall, leaving a dent, a physical scar marking the moment arrogance collided with reality. His rage was not directed solely at the broken system. It was aimed at his ignorance. He should have known better than to trust appearances over performance. But pride had blinded him. As panic rippled outward, the board called an emergency meeting. Executives flooded the conference room, clutching laptops and tablets that displayed red warning messages. The atmosphere, once marked by suits and smiles, became a battlefield of blame. They dissected decisions, questioned hiring practices, and pointed fingers at anyone within range. No one dared mention the uncomfortable truth. They had dismissed the only person who understood the software, not because of incompetence, but because of an imagined deficiency in personality. Their arrogance had cost them stability. Director Hammond, known for his dramatic speeches, attempted to restore order. He lectured the room about responsibility, but his voice cracked when he realized he was lecturing ghosts of his own decisions. He suggested outsourcing the crisis to consulting firms. One executive noted that consultants could not access a system without the authentication code. The room fell silent. Hammond sank into his chair, stripped of authority. Outside the conference room, customer relations crumbled. Clients, who expected seamless reports and guaranteed deadlines, received apologies filled with vagueness. Some threatened lawsuits. Others demanded financial compensation for delays. Investors started whispering about potential instability. Stocks twitched with nervous energy. Rumors spread faster than clarifications. The company's veneer of professionalism disintegrated. Marketing attempted damage control, producing statements about innovative infrastructure and proactive upgrades. Their optimism sounded delusional. The public relations officer tried to convince journalists that minor issues were being resolved. Reporters sensed blood. They requested interviews with executives who suddenly became unavailable. The legal department braced for impact, reviewing contracts to quantify damages. Every missing document translated into potential liability. Without the reports, clients could not file taxes. Without filings, regulators would act. Legal discovered that negligence was easier to prove than incompetence. Their hearts sank. Inside tech support, programmers sat in paralyzed disbelief. They admired the system, but had never dared modify its core. They considered contacting me secretly, but feared retaliation. They debated whether reaching out would be seen as betrayal or salvation. Some recalled the HR announcement that my departure was a necessary adjustment. Now that phrase sounded like a curse. Corporate culture shifted in hours. Smiles, once mandatory, disappeared faster than profits. The executives who had mocked seriousness now mirrored my expression, focused, silent, and aware that disaster required attention, not cheerfulness. The CEO, who previously celebrated morale surveys, now demanded results. He slammed his hand on the conference table and barked orders no one could fulfill. His leadership stood exposed for what it was, performance without substance. As deadlines approached, countdown timers glowed red on every monitor. Numbers marched downward, reminding everyone that time listened to no apology. Departments that once competed for praise now competed for survival. Employees scrambled to assemble paperwork manually, an impossible task given the scale of the data. They typed frantically, hoping sheer effort could replace automation. It couldn't. Meanwhile, the server room, usually a quiet sanctuary, felt like a command center under siege. Technicians monitored logs that made no sense. Error messages replicated like viral cells. Every keystroke generated new warnings. The system's architecture defended itself, refusing to execute commands without proper authorization. It was no longer software. It was a locked vault guarded by rules no one remembered. Whispers about me spread like folklore. Some employees insisted I had predicted this. Others claimed I had sabotaged the system. A few voices insisted I had been mistreated. The truth didn't matter. The result was undeniable. Their arrogance had consequences. They had prioritized comfort over competence, believing no individual was irreplaceable. They were learning the most expensive lesson of their careers. Systems don't fail. People do. By sunset, the building resembled a beleaguered fortress. Exhaustion settled on faces, and even the optimistic in turn understood that corporations were not playgrounds. Success required more than energy. It required mastery. Arrogance had shaped decisions. Reality now demanded payment. My phone began vibrating before sunrise, its screen lighting up like a distress beacon. The first call came from an unknown corporate extension, followed seconds later by a barrage of notifications. When I glanced at the caller ID, my eyebrows lifted. It was HR, the same department that escorted me out of the building with a smile and a policy pamphlet. Their voicemail trembled with urgency. They claimed there had been a misunderstanding, that the decision to terminate me might have been premature. They asked me to return immediately for clarification. Their tone was nothing like the confident dismissal I received days earlier. It carried fear disguised as courtesy. I ignored the message. Almost instantly, another call appeared. This time, it was the CFO. His voice cracked with panic. Gone was the arrogant certainty that numbers always fell into place. He admitted the company was at risk of catastrophic penalties. Regulators were demanding finalized reports, banks were requesting proof of compliance, and clients were threatening legal action. He pleaded for my assistance, offering compensation far beyond my former salary. He claimed the company needed me, not as an employee, but as a savior. Desperation coded every syllable. Before I could process his plea, my phone rang again. The CEO was on the line. The same man who once praised corporate cheerfulness now spoke like someone clinging to a lifeline. His voice, usually loaded with confidence and strategy, shook. He apologized repeatedly, stumbling through rehearsed lines about organizational values and unfortunate circumstances. He insisted my termination had been a miscommunication rooted in an overzealous pursuit of workplace harmony. The irony nearly made me laugh. Their quest for positivity had transformed into a nightmare. The CEO didn't care about smiles anymore. He cared about survival. He explained that the software had locked, executing a failsafe I personally built to prevent unauthorized tampering. Every attempt to override the system triggered warnings. They had tried consultants, technicians, and retired staff. Nothing worked. The system refused to proceed without the master authentication code. They assumed the code existed somewhere in a file, but eventually realized the truth they had ignored. I was the file. I remained silent as he talked. Silence unnerved powerful men more than insults. He offered stock options, a corner office, and a leadership title. He promised full authority over the system, no interference, no oversight. He even hinted at replacing senior management if necessary. The CEO, who once believed people were interchangeable parts, now begged for the one component he could not replace. Before the conversation ended, another call arrived. The board chair, someone I had never personally spoken to, requested a meeting. His tone lacked pretense. He acknowledged their failure. He confessed that the board underestimated the complexity of my work and overvalued personality metrics. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he proposed something unprecedented: autonomy. I could rewrite my position, redefine my compensation, and dictate the terms of my return. He said the board recognized their mistake. I didn't believe him. Recognition implied understanding. Their desperation wasn't flattering. It was predictable. They thought systems existed independent of their creators. They believed institutional confidence could substitute for competence. They assumed enthusiasm equaled capability. Now, they confronted the consequences of their own arrogance. Without me, deadlines transformed into detonators. Every minute increased the financial damage. Government fines alone could cripple the company. The clock wasn't ticking, it was accelerating. As I listened to their apologies, a realization formed. They never valued me. They valued what I prevented: disaster. My worth became clear only when absence revealed it. When I finally stepped back into the building, the atmosphere was nothing like the day I left. Gone were the smug smiles, the cheerful greetings, and the forced positivity posters that once decorated every surface. The energy had shifted. People watched me as if I were not a former employee, but a negotiator arriving to discuss the terms of surrender. Every eye followed me, not out of admiration, but fear of what might happen if I refused to help. The company no longer treated me as a resource. They treated me like oxygen. I didn't return as an employee. That door had closed the moment they valued atmosphere over expertise. I came back as a consultant. My rate wasn't suggested, negotiated, or reviewed. It was declared. Whatever figure I typed into the contract became law. No director objected. No legal department questioned it. They signed faster than they breathed. For once, the company understood something important. Skill has no market price when the alternative is extinction. I wore the same expression they once punished: neutral, focused, grave. The irony was satisfying. No one asked me to smile. No one asked whether I felt engaged. They cared only that their systems remained functional long enough to avoid the avalanche waiting outside, financial penalties, regulatory sanctions, and client exodus. They led me directly to the server room. It looked like a war zone. Screens flashed red warnings, processors hummed under impossible pressure, and error logs scrolled like death sentences. The intern stood nearby, shoulders hunched, eyes swollen. He looked as though he had aged years and days. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence confessed everything. Directors hovered behind me, whispering instructions no one needed. Their voices shook. They reminded me of surgeons watching a patient whose pulse was disappearing. They weren't leaders anymore. They were spectators of their own failure. I approached the console with a calm they found unsettling. I entered one command. Just one. A string of characters no manual contained, no policy documented, no intern imagined. The system paused, blinked, and then obediently unlocked. Gasps rippled through the room. A few employees stepped backward as though they had witnessed something supernatural. To them, it was magic. To me, it was maintenance. With access restored, I navigated through encrypted layers, restructuring modules and reversing reckless changes the intern had attempted. The system responded instantly, as if relieved to be in familiar hands. Files synchronized. Calculations recalibrated. The digital suffocation stopped. The tax engine, dormant for days, exhaled its first functional breath. Directors stared as if watching a surgeon resurrect a patient they had already pronounced dead. They whispered about my talent as if it were mystical. But there was nothing mystical about it, only discipline, memory, and responsibility. The same qualities they once dismissed as intensity. The CFO stood closest. He looked at me the way a gambler looks at the dealer holding his last card. His arrogance had evaporated. Only necessity remained. He didn't dare interrupt. His confidence had been replaced by reverence. Once stability returned, I generated the reports they desperately needed. The filings processed cleanly, without errors, without delays. What had been impossible 5 hours earlier was now routine. The system obeyed because the architect had returned, not with joy, but with precision. They thanked me, but gratitude meant nothing anymore. My return wasn't a gesture of loyalty. It was a transaction. And unlike employment, transactions had boundaries. The company didn't recover because they were smart. They recovered because I decided they were worth saving for now. Once the software stabilized and the final tax submissions were confirmed, a hush settled over the office. The chaos that had consumed the building for days dissolved into a tense stillness. Leaders who once barked orders now hovered quietly, waiting for reassurance. They believed the worst was over. They had no idea the reckoning had just begun. Systems might forgive technical errors, but history never ignores negligence. I walked to a terminal and initiated a command sequence no one else knew existed. The system compiled logs, years of archived correspondence, update requests, documented warnings, and escalation notices. It retrieved every ignored message, every unanswered ticket, every plea for backup infrastructure, and every risk assessment I had provided. Thousands of pages emerged, each one stamped with dates, signatures, and evidence. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The system spoke for me. The report printed for nearly an hour. Employees watched silently as paper stacked like courtroom exhibits. When the final page emerged, I bound the documents and headed toward the boardroom. The doors, always open before, now stood guarded. Executives whispered nervously as I approached. They knew something was coming, but not at scale. They assumed I was bringing technical data. They didn't expect a chronicle of their own arrogance. Inside, the board sat around a polished table, faces drained by exhaustion and fear. I placed the report in front of them without a word. The room fell silent as they opened it. Their eyes scanned page after page, each entry colder than the last. There were timestamps of system vulnerabilities I had identified, requests for emergency patches, and warnings about compliance gaps. Every ignored suggestion appeared beside the original sender. They couldn't deny any of it. The evidence was irrefutable. They didn't fire an employee. They deleted expertise. That phrase, captured in one of my final emails, echoed through the pages like a verdict. It was no longer an accusation, it was proof. The CFO, who had treated technology like a disposable commodity, grew pale. His hands trembled as he reached the section outlining the financial risks of neglecting software maintenance. He understood now that the disaster wasn't an accident. It was a consequence waiting to happen. HR, once proud enforcers of culture, realized this wasn't a software failure, it was a policy failure. Their obsession with smiles had blinded them to operational integrity. The HR director attempted to defend the decision that led to my dismissal. The board cut her off. Nobody entertained lectures about positivity now that the truth sat on glossy pages. She resigned before morning, leaving her office key on her desk like a confession. Then came the moment everyone anticipated. The board summoned my former manager, the man who had reduced my years of work to a personality critique. He walked in with shoulders slumped, no trace of the arrogant swagger he once carried. When confronted with the evidence, he tried to argue that morale mattered. The board chairman interrupted him, pointing to the cost breakdown of the disaster his decision created. There was no rebuttal. Security entered moments later. He didn't smile. He didn't protest. He simply walked out, escorted by the same force he once believed protected him. The board turned to me, waiting for a speech. I offered none. My work was not a performance. The system had done the talking. They now understood what I tried to explain for years. Technology is loyal, but only to those who respect it. They had treated expertise like decoration. They had learned that ignorance comes with invoices. By the time I left the boardroom, relief and regret mingled in the air. They finally listened, but only because the system made them. My consultancy did not grow gradually. It erupted. The moment news of the company's near collapse leaked through corporate circles, executives who once ignored me now approached with urgency. They didn't want speeches or team-building seminars. They wanted stability. They wanted someone who understood the quiet mechanics behind systems that appeared effortless until they failed. My contracts multiplied, and my income exceeded the entire budget of my former department. Companies didn't hire me for personality. They hired me because I delivered results that silence could measure. My calendar filled with boardroom invitations, emergency audits, and confidential meetings. CEOs who once valued charisma now insisted on competence. They didn't care how often I smiled. They cared whether their systems would survive fiscal audits, regulatory changes, and software transitions. It amused me to watch leaders who once measured engagement through enthusiasm now measure success through operational immunity. The world had changed not because of slogans, but because of consequences. My story spread across industries like a cautionary tale. It resurfaced in conferences, leadership trainings, and private circles where executives whispered it to each other like a corporate ghost story. The moral was always the same: ignore expertise at your own expense. Employees forwarded clips of my interviews, where I explained the cost of elevating style over substance. IT managers printed my quotes on their doors. Suddenly, seriousness wasn't a character flaw. It was a strategic advantage. Meanwhile, my former employer operated under a shadow. Investors demanded oversight. Regulators requested documentation. Journalists dissected the story of the smiling termination that cost millions. Employees, once obsessed with positivity metrics, now treated performance reviews as survival manuals. Meetings no longer opened with jokes. They opened with contingency plans. The HR department restructured, and mandatory engagement initiatives quietly vanished. Cheerfulness had become a liability. The board built a new department dedicated to system redundancy, one based on the precise recommendations I had offered years earlier. They spent 10 times the amount they once deemed unnecessary. Every dollar reminded them of the price of arrogance. My name hung in the air like a warning they could not erase. When auditors asked how the crisis unfolded, executives struggled to explain how a corporate culture allowed emotional preference to override operational necessity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply removed the invisible safety net I had provided. Without it, the truth revealed itself. Systems aren't fragile. Leadership is. People assume stability comes from tools, but tools obey their masters. When the master leaves, the illusion collapses. That collapse became my legacy. When I occasionally crossed paths with former colleagues, their expressions changed. Gone was the subtle doubt, the forced humor, the condescending smiles. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and regret. They finally understood the difference between confidence and competence. Competence builds structures. Confidence decorates them. One survives earthquakes. The other blows away in wind. As for the manager who once demanded my smile, his influence evaporated. Future employers researched his history and hesitated. He learned what HR never taught him. Firing someone for the wrong reason is an endorsement of ignorance. He never apologized. He didn't need to. His silence confirmed understanding. The consequences spoke louder than remorse. My consultancy now thrives, not because of revenge, but because truth doesn't require permission. Companies discovered that politeness can't replace proficiency. They hired me not to improve morale, but to prevent catastrophe. My face still carries the same expression they despised: neutral, focused, unbothered. That expression became a brand. They fired me for not smiling. I gave them something better, a smile they will never forget, the one I didn't have to show.